Liberal journalist mocks John Kennedy in public. His stunning response leaves everyone silent. The studio lights blazed down on the sleek modern set of the late-night spotlight, casting a glossy sheen over the iconic glass desk, the plush armchair reserved for guests, and the panoramic city skyline backdrop that framed the scene. The air buzzed with anticipation, a palpable energy that pulsed through the crew as they adjusted cameras, tested microphones, and whispered last-minute instructions. The live audience, a diverse mix of young professionals, college students, and curious tourists, filed into their seats, their chatter a lively hum that filled the cavernous space. Fiona Carrington's name glowed on massive screens around the studio, a testament to the star power she wielded as the show's charismatic host. Known for her razor-sharp wit, unapologetic progressive stance, and a knack for dismantling guests with clever quips, Fiona had carved out a unique niche in late-night television. Her audience adored her, tuning in nightly to watch her skewer politicians, celebrities, and cultural icons with equal zeal. Her monologues, a blend of biting sarcasm and incisive commentary that left viewers laughing and thinking in equal measure. Tonight, however, promised to be something special, a potential ratings juggernaut that had the entire production team buzzing with excitement and a touch of apprehension. It was during a routine production meeting 2 weeks earlier that the idea had first surfaced. The team had gathered in a cramped conference room surrounded by coffee cups and laptops, brainstorming guests who could spark buzz for the show. Names of pop stars, comedians, and rising political figures were tossed around, but none seemed to ignite the room until Veronica, Fiona's head writer, leaned forward with a mischievous glint in her eye. "What about John Kennedy?" she suggested, her voice cutting through the chatter. "The senator from Louisiana. He's got that folksy charm, those quirky one-liners. People either love him or love to hate him. It could be a gold mine." The room erupted in a mix of laughter and skeptical murmurs. Fiona, perched at the head of the table, raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a sly smile. John Kennedy, the Republican senator, known for his colorful metaphors and staunch conservative views, was an unconventional choice for a show that thrived on progressive sensibilities. But the more Fiona thought about it, the more the idea appealed to her. It wasn't just about ratings, though she knew a guest like Kennedy would draw viewers from across the political spectrum. It was a chance to showcase her skills, to take a figure who embodied what she saw as outdated ideals and expose them under the bright lights of her stage. To Fiona, this wasn't just an interview. It was a showdown, a chance to juxtapose her modern, incisive worldview against Kennedy's old-school Southern demeanor. Her audience would eat it up, she thought, already picturing the roaring laughter as she landed her carefully crafted jabs. Fiona threw herself into preparation with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. Her office became a war room littered with printouts of Kennedy's speeches, video clips of his Senate floor remarks, and articles analyzing his political career. She watched hours of footage, scribbling notes in the margins of her outline, her pen circling phrases like "oh shucks," "charm," and folksy aphorisms. She couldn't help but smirk as she watched him deliver lines like, "This is dumber than a sack of hammers," in his distinctive Louisiana drawl, his wire-rimmed glasses glinting under the Capitol's lights. To Fiona, Kennedy's style was a caricature, a throwback to a bygone era of politics that her audience loved to critique. She saw an opportunity to highlight the absurdity of his rhetoric, to contrast his homespun metaphors with her own polished urban sensibility. Her team worked tirelessly alongside her, crafting a monologue packed with clever digs at Kennedy's mannerisms and policy positions, each line designed to elicit maximum laughter from the live audience. "He's like your uncle who forwards chain emails, but with a Senate seat," Fiona quipped during a rehearsal, her writers erupting in laughter. The questions for the interview were equally sharp, loaded with irony and just enough humor to keep the tone playful while still landing punches. Fiona rehearsed her delivery in front of a mirror, perfecting the arch of her eyebrow, the tilt of her head, the precise cadence that would make her barbs sting without crossing into outright hostility. She was ready, or so she thought. Meanwhile, in Louisiana, John Kennedy received the invitation with the same calm pragmatism that defined much of his public life. He was in his Baton Rouge office, a modest space filled with books, family photos, and a worn leather chair that creaked when he leaned back. The letter from the late-night spotlight sat on his desk, its glossy letterhead catching the sunlight streaming through the window. His aide, a young man named Ethan, stood nearby, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Are you sure about this?" Senator Ethan asked, adjusting his tie nervously. "Fiona Carrington's show isn't exactly friendly territory. She's got a reputation for tearing into people like you." Kennedy leaned back in his chair, his hands folded across his chest, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Ethan, I've been in tougher rooms than a TV studio," he said, his voice carrying the slow, deliberate cadence of his southern roots. "A conversation's a conversation. Let her say what she wants. It doesn't change what's true." Ethan wasn't convinced. He'd seen clips of Fiona's interviews, her quick wit, reducing seasoned politicians to stammering wrecks. "She's going to come at you hard," he pressed. "Your style, your votes, probably even your accent. You know how these things go." Kennedy chuckled a low, rumbling sound. "Let her try," he said simply, setting the letter down and glancing out the window at the Mississippi River in the distance. "Sometimes you don't win by arguing. You win by showing up." The days leading up to the interview were a study in contrasts. Fiona's team operated like a well-oiled machine, refining every detail of the show. Writers tweaked the monologue, producers scouted audience reactions during test runs, and Fiona herself practiced her opening lines until they flowed effortlessly. The studio was transformed into a battleground of sorts, with every element, the lighting, the music, the camera angles designed to amplify Fiona's presence and put her guest on the defensive. Back in Louisiana, Kennedy carried on with his routine as if nothing extraordinary loomed on the horizon. He spent his days meeting constituents, reviewing legislation, and taking calls from colleagues, his evenings reserved for quiet moments with a book or a walk along the riverfront. When Ethan pressed him to prepare to rehearse potential responses to Fiona's inevitable attacks, Kennedy waved him off. "I don't need to practice being myself," he said, his tone firm but kind. "I'll know what to say when the time comes." Ethan shook his head, muttering under his breath about the senator's stubbornness, but there was a grudging respect in his eyes. Kennedy's confidence wasn't bravado. It was the quiet assurance of a man who had faced countless challenges and trusted his instincts to carry him through. When the day of the show arrived, the studio was a hive of activity. Crew members darted across the set, their headsets crackling with instructions while the audience settled into their seats, their excitement palpable. Backstage, Fiona was in her element, surrounded by her team as she reviewed her notes one last time. Her makeup was flawless, her tailored blazer sharp, and her confidence unshakable. She rehearsed a few lines under her breath, savoring the bite of her opening jab. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have a senator who thinks governing is like herding cats, except the cats have better ideas." Her head writer Veronica grinned from across the room. "This is going to be legendary," Veronica said, adjusting her glasses. "Kennedy's a walking soundbite, but he's no match for you." Fiona nodded, her smirk widening. "He's not going to know what hit him," she replied, clipping on her microphone. The energy backstage was electric, a mix of adrenaline and anticipation as the crew counted down to the live broadcast. In the green room, John Kennedy waited patiently, a stark contrast to the frenetic energy around him. Dressed in a simple suit, with a crisp white shirt and an understated tie, he sat in a chair sipping water and exchanging polite nods with the crew members who popped in to check on him. Ethan hovered nearby, his nerves evident as he scrolled through his phone, reading last-minute notes on Fiona's interviewing style. "You sure you don't want to go over some talking points?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. Kennedy glanced at him, his expression calm. "Ethan, if I start planning every word, I won't sound like me," he said. "Folks can tell when you're genuine. That's all I need to be." Ethan sighed, shaking his head, but there was no arguing with the senator when he'd made up his mind. On the monitor, the show's opening sequence began, the theme music swelling as Fiona's name flashed across the screen. The audience roared, their cheers echoing through the studio, a reminder of the home field advantage Fiona held. Kennedy watched the screen, his face unreadable, though a faint twinkle in his eyes suggested he was more amused than intimidated. As the countdown to the live broadcast ticked down, the contrast between the two figures was striking. Fiona, a whirlwind of energy and ambition, saw the interview as a chance to cement her reputation as a fearless host, to take a senator known for his quirky charm and turn him into a punchline. Kennedy, calm and unassuming, saw it as an opportunity to share his perspective with an audience that might not otherwise hear it. For Fiona, the night was about winning, about dominating the conversation and sending her viewers into a frenzy of laughter and applause. For Kennedy, it was about something simpler, speaking his truth, no matter the reception. Neither could have predicted how the night would unfold, how the clash of their worlds would spark something far greater than either had anticipated. The stage was set. The audience was ready, and as the cameras prepared to roll, the air crackled with the promise of a confrontation that would be anything but ordinary. The studio lights dimmed briefly as the opening theme of the late-night spotlight faded, signaling the start of the live broadcast. The audience's energy surged, their applause a thunderous wave that filled the sleek modern set. Fiona Carrington strode onto the stage with her signature confidence, her tailored blazer catching the light, her smile sharp and practiced. She waved to the crowd, basking in their cheers, her presence commanding every corner of the room. The city skyline backdrop gleamed behind her, a perfect frame for the star of the show. Fiona settled behind her glass desk, her notes neatly arranged, and leaned into the microphone with the ease of someone who knew she owned the night. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice bright and laced with mischief. "Welcome to the late-night spotlight, where we shine a light on the bold, the bizarre, and the downright bewildering. And tonight, we've got a real treat for you." The audience laughed already, hooked, their anticipation palpable, as Fiona's eyes sparkled with the promise of a spectacle. Fiona launched into her monologue, her delivery polished and brimming with energy. She opened with a few light-hearted jabs at the week's headlines. A quirky tech mogul, a viral internet trend, before pivoting to her guest. "Folks, tonight, we have a senator from Louisiana, John Kennedy," she said, her tone dripping with playful sarcasm. "A man who's made a career out of sounding like your grandpa telling stories on the porch, except this grandpa's got a law degree and a knack for metaphors that make you wonder if he's been drinking the bayou water." The audience erupted in laughter, clapping and cheering, as Fiona grinned, clearly delighted with the reaction. She leaned forward, her voice dropping conspiratorially. "I mean, this is a guy who once said something was dumber than a bag of hammers." A bag of hammers, folks. I don't know what's in the Louisiana air, but I'm pretty sure it's not Oxford-level rhetoric. The crowd roared again, some whistling, others slapping their knees, fully on board with Fiona's takedown. She continued with a string of quips about Kennedy's folksy style, his conservative voting record, and his knack for turning Senate hearings into soundbite gold. Each line was a carefully crafted dart designed to keep the audience laughing while painting Kennedy as a relic of a bygone political era. Backstage, her head writer, Veronica, watched from the wings, nodding approvingly. "She's killing it," Veronica whispered to a producer who gave a thumbs up. The monologue was a hit, and Fiona knew it. As the laughter died down, Fiona straightened in her chair, her smile still sharp, but her eyes gleaming with anticipation. "But enough from me," she said, gesturing to the side of the stage. "Let's bring him out and see if he can keep up. Please welcome Senator John Kennedy." The applause was enthusiastic, but mixed with some cheers, mingling with a few skeptical murmurs. The audience, primed by Fiona's monologue, was ready for a verbal sparring match. John Kennedy walked onto the stage with a relaxed stride, his suit simple but well-fitted, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the studio lights. He waved to the crowd, a small, genuine smile on his face, and shook Fiona's hand firmly before tipping an imaginary hat to the audience, earning a few chuckles. He settled into the guest chair, his posture, easy hands resting lightly on his knees, as if he were sitting on a porch rather than under the glare of a national spotlight. "Senator Kennedy, welcome to the show." Fiona began, her tone light, but with an edge of mockery. "Thanks for having me, Fiona Kennedy," replied his Louisiana drawl, slow and deliberate. "Nice crowd you've got here. Feels like a Saturday night at the crawfish boil." The audience laughed, caught off guard by his easy charm, and Fiona raised an eyebrow, sensing the first ripple of a challenge. The tension in the room was electric, as Fiona leaned forward, her hands clasped on her desk, ready to fire her first shot. "So, Senator," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes, "you've been in Washington a while now, and you've got this unique way of talking. All these colorful sayings, colder than a well-digger's knee, slicker than a peeled onion. Do you ever worry that folks might not take you seriously when you sound like you're auditioning for a Mark Twain novel?" The audience burst into laughter, clapping and hooting clearly on Fiona's side. Kennedy tilted his head slightly, his expression unruffled, a faint twinkle in his eyes. "Well, Fiona," he said, his voice steady, "I reckon folks can take me seriously or not. That's their choice. But I've found that a good story or a saying that sticks gets people listening. And if they're listening, maybe they'll hear the point I'm trying to make." His calm response earned a few polite claps, but Fiona wasn't ready to let him off that easily. "Sure, but times change, don't they?" She pressed her tone, sharpening. "Your style, it's very, let's say, traditional. Don't you think it might come off as out of touch in a world that's moving faster than one of your bayou metaphors?" The crowd laughed again, some leaning forward in their seats, eager for Kennedy's response. Kennedy chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair, completely at ease. "Out of touch. Maybe to some," he said, his drawl warm and unhurried. "But let me tell you something, Fiona. I was at a diner back home last week, and a fella there works 2 jobs, raising 3 kids, told me he's tired of fancy talk from folks who don't know his life. He said, 'John, you talk like us, and that's why we trust you.' Now, I don't know if that's modern or not, but it's real. And real's what matters to folks like him." The laughter in the room softened, replaced by a murmur of surprise and a few nods from the audience. Fiona blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the simplicity and sincerity of his answer. She hadn't expected him to sidestep her jab with a story that landed so effectively. Backstage, Ethan Kennedy's aide exhaled in relief, muttering to a crew member, "He's got this." But Fiona was far from done. "That's a nice story," she said, recovering quickly, her smile tight. "But let's talk about your votes in the Senate. You've taken some pretty conservative stances. Some might say they don't exactly line up with where the country's headed. Don't you worry that you're on the wrong side of progress." The audience cheered, egging her on their energy firmly in her corner. Kennedy didn't flinch. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped, his gaze steady. "Fiona, I don't worry about being on the right side of anything," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I worry about doing what I think is right for the people I serve. Progress is a fine word, but it's not a one-size-fits-all deal. What looks like progress to one person might look like trouble to another. My job is to listen to folks, farmers, teachers, small business owners, and vote in a way that helps them sleep better at night. If that makes me unpopular in some circles, well, I've been unpopular before." A ripple of applause broke out, stronger than before, and Fiona sensed a shift in the room. The audience, still mostly on her side, was starting to listen to Kennedy, drawn in by his unpretentious sincerity. She pressed on, determined to regain control. "But don't you think that kind of stubbornness can alienate people?" she asked, her voice laced with mock concern. "I mean, the world's changing, and some might say you're holding on to ideas that don't fit anymore." Kennedy smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You call it stubbornness, Fiona. I call it sticking to what you believe," he said. "Let me tell you a quick story. Back in Louisiana, there's an old oak tree near my house, been there longer than any of us. Storms come, winds howl, but that tree stands tall because its roots are deep. Change is good, but if you don't have roots, you'll blow over in the first gust. I'd rather be that tree than a tumbleweed." The audience laughed, but it was a different kind of laughter now, warmer, more appreciative. A few people clapped, and even Fiona couldn't help a small smile, though she quickly masked it. "That's a good one," she conceded, her tone lighter, but still probing. "But surely you can admit there's room for new ideas, right? The world's not a bayou, it's moving fast." Kennedy nodded, unfazed. "Plenty of room for new ideas," he said. "But good ideas don't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes the quiet ones, the ones that come from listening to folks, are the ones that stick." The room grew quieter, the audience caught off guard by the clarity of his words. Fiona faltered slightly, her usual rhythm disrupted. She'd expected defensiveness, maybe a stumble, but Kennedy was meeting her every jab with a calm conviction that was starting to resonate. The contrast between them was stark. Fiona's high-energy provocation versus Kennedy's grounded, almost folksy wisdom. Slowly, the balance of the stage began to shift, and the audience, once firmly in Fiona's camp, started to lean in, curious to hear more from the senator they'd come to mock. Backstage, Veronica whispered to the producer, "He's tougher than he looks." Fiona glanced at her notes, realizing this was no ordinary interview. Kennedy wasn't just holding his own, he was changing the game. The studio lights softened slightly, casting a warm glow over the set of the late-night spotlight as the interview with Senator John Kennedy entered its next phase. The audience, still buzzing from the initial verbal sparring, had settled into a quieter, more attentive state, their earlier laughter giving way to curiosity. Fiona Carrington, seated behind her sleek glass desk, felt the shift in the room. Her sharp jabs had landed, but Kennedy's calm, folksy responses were starting to draw the crowd in, their reactions less predictable than she'd expected. She adjusted her posture, her confident smile still in place, but tempered by a flicker of uncertainty. Across from her, Kennedy sat relaxed, his wire-rimmed glasses glinting under the lights, his hands resting lightly on his knees. The contrast between them, Fiona's polished energy and Kennedy's unhurried sincerity, was stark, and it was beginning to reshape the dynamic of the night. Fiona leaned forward, her voice softer now, sensing she needed to pivot. "All right, Senator," she said, her tone less mocking, but still probing. You've got this way of connecting with people. I'll give you that. But let's dig a little deeper. You talk about listening to folks. Farmers, teachers, everyday people. How do you stay grounded like that in a place like Washington, where everyone's shouting their own agenda? Kennedy tilted his head, his expression thoughtful, a faint smile tugging at his lips. That's a fair question, Fiona, he said, his Louisiana drawl warm and deliberate. Washington's a noisy place, no doubt about it. Everybody's got an opinion, and they're all trying to be the loudest voice in the room. But I learned a long time ago that noise ain't the same as substance. He paused, letting the words settle, and the audience leaned in their attention locked on him. Let me tell you a little story. He continued, his voice steady. Back when I was a young lawyer just starting out, I had a client. An older fella ran a small grocery store. He wasn't rich, didn't have much schooling, but he had a way of seeing things clear as day. One day, I was all worked up about a case, talking a mile a minute, throwing around legal jargon like it was going out of style. He just looked at me, shook his head, and said, "John, you're talking so loud I can't hear you." That stuck with me. The audience chuckled softly, the humor of the anecdote breaking the tension, but Kennedy's point landed deeper. That man taught me something, he said. If you want to understand what matters, you've got to stop talking and start listening. Really listening, not just waiting for your turn to speak. Fiona blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity and weight of his words. She'd expected another quirky metaphor, not a story that felt so human, so relatable. The audience murmured in agreement, a few nodding their earlier skepticism, softening. Fiona recovered quickly, tilting her head with a small smile. "That's a good lesson," she said, her voice genuine for the first time. "But, let's be real. Senator listening's hard when everyone's got something to say, especially in politics. How do you decide who's worth listening to?" Kennedy leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped, his gaze steady. "You listen to the folks who aren't shouting," he said. "The ones who are too busy working, raising families, keeping their heads above water to make a fuss. Those are the people who'll tell you what's really going on, not the ones with the biggest megaphones." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. "I remember a woman I met at a town hall a while back. Single mom, 2 kids, working as a nurse. She didn't have a fancy speech prepared, didn't want to be on TV. But she sat me down and told me how hard it was to pay for her kids' school supplies on her wages. That conversation meant more to me than 100 press conferences because it was real." The studio grew quieter, the audience hanging on his words. A young woman in the front row nodded, her expression thoughtful, while a man in the back shifted in his seat, clearly moved. Fiona, who had spent years perfecting the art of steering conversations, found herself pausing, letting Kennedy's story linger. She glanced at the crowd, noticing their rapt attention, and realized she was no longer fully in control of the room. "That's powerful," she said after a moment, her tone softer, almost introspective. "But doesn't it ever get overwhelming? Hearing all these stories, carrying all that weight, how do you not let it drown you?" Kennedy chuckled, a low, warm sound that eased the tension. "Oh, it can weigh on you, no question," he said. "But here's the thing, Fiona, those stories aren't a burden. They're a reminder. They remind me why I do what I do, why I get up every morning and keep going, even when the world feels like it's coming apart at the seams. You carry those stories with you, and they give you purpose." Fiona tilted her head, intrigued despite herself. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about her next quip, or how to spin Kennedy's words against him. She was listening, really listening, and it felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling. "Purpose," she repeated, her voice quieter. "That's a big word. How do you know when you've found it?" Kennedy smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You don't always know right away," he said. "Purpose isn't something that shows up with a neon sign. It's something you build piece by piece from the things you care about, the people you help. The times you choose to do what's right even when it's hard." He leaned back, his tone lightening. "I'll tell you another quick story, if you don't mind. When I was a kid, my daddy used to take me fishing on the bayou. One day I caught this little fish too small to keep, but I was so proud. I wanted to show it off. But Daddy said, 'John, let it go. It's not about what you catch. It's about what you learn while you're out here.' That's purpose, Fiona. It's not the big wins or the shiny moments. It's the lessons you pick up along the way, the ones that make you better." The audience erupted in soft applause, the sound genuine and heartfelt. A far cry from the raucous cheers that had greeted Fiona's opening monologue. A middle-aged woman in the crowd wiped her eyes, her face reflecting a mix of admiration and personal connection. Even Fiona, who prided herself on her quick wit, found herself momentarily at a loss. Kennedy's words weren't flashy or rehearsed, but they carried a quiet power that resonated deeply. Backstage, Ethan Kennedy's aide grinned, whispering to a crew member, "I told you he'd surprise them." Fiona glanced at her notes, realizing they felt irrelevant now. She closed the folder and met Kennedy's eyes, her usual bravado replaced by curiosity. "You make it sound so simple," she said, her voice tinged with respect. "But life's not always that clear, is it? What about when things get messy, when you're not sure what's right or who to listen to?" Kennedy nodded, his expression softening. "Life's messy, no doubt," he said, "but that's when listening matters most, not just to others, but to yourself. You've got to know what you stand for, Fiona, because the world's always going to try to pull you in 100 directions. When things get tough, I think about that nurse, that grocer, the folks who trust me to speak for them. They're my compass. They keep me grounded." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over the audience like a warm blanket. Fiona leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She'd come into this interview expecting to dominate, to turn Kennedy into a punchline, but instead he was turning the stage into a space for reflection. The audience, once eager to laugh at her jabs, now sat in contemplative silence, their expressions a mix of awe and introspection. Kennedy, with his unassuming demeanor and heartfelt stories, was doing something Fiona hadn't anticipated. He was connecting not just with her, but with everyone in the room. As the segment neared its end, Fiona felt a shift within herself. For years, she'd thrived on being the sharpest voice in the room, using her platform to challenge and provoke. But Kennedy's quiet sincerity was making her question that approach, even if just for a moment. The cameras panned to the audience, capturing their thoughtful faces, some smiling, others nodding, as if Kennedy's words had struck a personal chord. Backstage, Veronica whispered to the producer, "This is going viral. He's not what we expected." Fiona glanced at Kennedy, who sat calmly, his hands still resting on his knees, as if he hadn't just turned her carefully planned interview upside down. The stage, once a battleground, was becoming something else, a place where real conversation was possible, where differences could coexist without descending into chaos. And as the crew signaled the approaching commercial break, Fiona realized this night was far from over. Kennedy wasn't just holding his own, he was changing the rules, and she was starting to wonder what else he had in store. The studio lights dimmed slightly, creating an intimate atmosphere as the late-night spotlight neared its conclusion. The audience, once boisterous and quick to laugh at Fiona Carrington's sharp jabs, now sat in a hushed, reflective silence, their attention fixed on Senator John Kennedy. The sleek set with its glass desk and city skyline backdrop felt less like a battleground and more like a quiet gathering place, transformed by Kennedy's unassuming wisdom. Fiona, seated across from him, had shed much of her earlier bravado. Her notes, once a roadmap for witty attacks, lay untouched, her posture softer, her eyes meeting Kennedy's with a mix of respect and curiosity. The interview had taken an unexpected turn, evolving from a planned takedown into a profound conversation that had captivated the room. Fiona leaned forward, her voice quieter than usual, as she posed her final question. "Senator," she began, her tone genuine, "you've shared stories about listening, about staying grounded, about finding purpose. But let's get personal for a moment. What's the one lesson you've learned in life that you'd want everyone here, everyone watching, to carry with them?" Kennedy leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped his wire-rimmed glasses, catching the soft glow of the lights. A faint smile played on his lips, but his eyes grew distant, as if sifting through a lifetime of memories. "That's a big question, Fiona," he said, his Louisiana drawl warm and deliberate. "I've learned a lot of lessons, most of them the hard way. But if I had to pick one, it'd be this: life's not about being the loudest or the smartest in the room. It's about building bridges, even when folks are standing on opposite sides of the river." He paused, letting the words settle, and the audience leaned in, hanging on his every syllable. "Let me tell you a story," he continued, his voice steady and unhurried. "Years ago, back in Louisiana, I was at a community meeting in a small town. Folks were upset about a local issue. Nothing fancy, just a dispute over some land use. Half the room wanted one thing, half wanted the other, and everybody was talking over each other, shouting, pointing fingers. It was a mess, and I was supposed to be the one to calm things down. I'll be honest, I didn't know if I could." The audience was utterly silent, drawn into the vivid picture Kennedy painted. Fiona, who had spent the interview searching for openings to challenge him, found herself listening intently, her usual instinct to interrupt replaced by a desire to hear more. "So I stood up," Kennedy went on, "and I didn't try to outshout anybody. I just asked everyone to take a breath and tell me one at a time what they were really worried about. And you know what happened? They started talking, not yelling, talking. A farmer said he was scared of losing his livelihood. A young mom said she wanted a safe place for her kids to play. An older fella said he just didn't want the town to lose its history. Once folks felt heard, they started listening to each other. By the end of the night, they didn't agree on everything, but they were working together to find a way forward. That's when I realized something: you don't build bridges by winning arguments. You build them by listening, by finding the common ground that's always there, if you look hard enough." A soft murmur ran through the audience, a mix of agreement and awe. A young man in the front row nodded, his face thoughtful, while a woman in the back wiped her eyes, clearly moved by the simplicity of the story. Fiona sat back, her expression a blend of admiration and introspection. "That's powerful," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "But, Senator, we live in a world where people don't always want to listen. It's all shouting all the time on social media, in the news, everywhere. How do you keep believing in bridges when it feels like everyone's burning them down?" Kennedy chuckled softly, the sound warm and grounding. "Oh, it's not easy," he admitted. "Some days you want to throw your hands up and walk away. But you don't, because giving up doesn't fix anything. You keep showing up, keep listening, keep trying, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Because every time you reach out, every time you try to understand someone who's different from you, you're planting a seed. It might not grow right away, but it's there, and that's what matters." The weight of his words settled over the room like a quiet storm. Fiona, who had built her career on commanding attention, felt a flicker of doubt about her own approach. For years, she'd thrived on being the sharpest, loudest voice, using her platform to challenge and provoke. But Kennedy's stories, his calm conviction, were making her wonder if she'd been missing something deeper. "You're saying it's about persistence," she said, her tone more reflective than challenging. "But what about when you're the one who feels unheard? When you're trying to build that bridge, but the other side won't meet you halfway?" Kennedy nodded, his expression softening. "That's the toughest part," he said. "When you feel like you're talking to a brick wall, it's tempting to give up. But let me tell you something my mama used to say, John, you can't control what other folks do, but you can control how you carry yourself. So you keep your side of the bridge strong. You keep it open. And you never know, someday someone might walk across it." The audience erupted in applause, not the raucous kind that had greeted Fiona's opening monologue, but a deep, heartfelt response that filled the studio with warmth. A middle-aged man in the crowd stood clapping, his face lit with admiration, while others followed their expressions, a mix of inspiration and gratitude. Fiona glanced at the audience, realizing the energy in the room had shifted completely. What had started as a sparring match was now a moment of connection, a rare pause in the noise of the world. She turned back to Kennedy, her usual quick wit replaced by sincerity. "I have to be honest, Senator," she said, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "I came into this thinking I'd be the one asking the tough questions, maybe even getting a few laughs at your expense. But you've made me think, really think about what it means to listen, to connect. I didn't expect that." Kennedy smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Life's full of surprises, Fiona," he said. "A good conversation's like a two-way street. You both get somewhere if you're willing to walk it together." The cameras zoomed in, capturing the moment a host humbled a guest, unassuming yet profound, and an audience moved by something real. As the crew signaled the final moments of the segment, Fiona closed her folder, her planned questions irrelevant now. "Thank you, Senator Kennedy," she said simply, her tone filled with respect, "for sharing your stories and reminding us that bridges are worth building even when it's hard." Kennedy nodded, tipping his imaginary hat once more. "Thanks for having me, Fiona. It's been a pleasure." The audience applauded again, the sound swelling as the cameras cut to commercial. The studio fell silent, the weight of Kennedy's words lingering like a gentle echo. Fiona sat motionless for a moment, staring at her desk, while Kennedy rose slowly, waving to the crowd, his calm demeanor unchanged. Backstage, the mood was subdued, but charged with emotion. Crew members approached Kennedy hesitantly, their earlier skepticism replaced by admiration. A young lighting tech shook his hand, saying, "That was incredible, Senator. I'm going to think about that bridge story for a long time." Kennedy smiled, his handshake firm. "Glad to hear it, son. Keep listening. It'll take you far." Meanwhile, Fiona retreated to her dressing room, her mind racing. She sank into a chair, staring at her reflection in the vanity mirror. The interview hadn't gone as planned. It had been something far greater. Kennedy hadn't just held his own. He'd shifted her perspective, made her question whether she was using her platform to divide or to connect. Was I listening? She thought, the question haunting in its simplicity. The next morning, clips of the interview flooded social media, shared by people from all walks of life. Kennedy's story about building bridges trended, with users posting their own experiences of finding common ground. John Kennedy just gave a masterclass in humanity, one tweet read, garnering thousands of likes. Fiona's show, typically known for its humor, was being praised for its depth, with viewers calling it a rare moment of authenticity in a noisy world. Fiona, scrolling through the responses in her apartment, felt a mix of pride and humility. She opened her laptop and typed a brief statement. Last night's conversation with Senator John Kennedy was a reminder that listening can change everything. Thank you for showing us how to build bridges. She hit publish, exhaling deeply, knowing this moment would reshape how she approached her work. For Kennedy, the aftermath was quieter. Back in Louisiana, he returned to his routine meeting constituents, reviewing legislation, walking along the riverfront. When his aide Ethan showed him the viral clips, Kennedy chuckled. "All I did was tell the truth, Ethan," he said. "Folks listen when they're ready." But the impact of his words rippled far beyond the studio. In homes, workplaces, and classrooms, people discussed his message of listening and connection, inspired to reach across divides in their own lives. The lesson was clear: in a world of shouting and division, the quiet act of listening could build bridges stronger than any argument. It was a call to empathy, to understanding, to carrying oneself with integrity, even when the world felt fractured. And for those who heard it, it was a reminder that sometimes the simplest truths speak the loudest.